Hi, my name is Ashley Herring, Director of Financial Services. You are listening to a Mississippi Baptist Convention Board production.
All right, thanks for listening to Around the Table, Mississippi Baptist Podcast. First intro with Ashley Herring.
That's right, Ashley Herring. She's been on staff for a little bit.
Yeah, I didn't know we had that.
Good for people to know that voice.
Yeah, no doubt. We are sitting down today again at the Mississippi Baptist Evangelism Conference, but Steve Gaines is out of the room and Jon Allen is in the room.
That's right. Wow, what an intro, Jon. This is good.
Yeah. This is going to be a letdown for Steve Gaines to me. I can tell you right now.
No, we're glad to have Jon Allen May, pastor at Eastpoint, church planter. How long has Eastpoint been around?
Eastpoint's 13 years old.
13 years old, and church planter, and now working with the 242 Network. So that's what we're going to talk about, 242 Network, all things church planting. But first, as always, Tanner likes to make announcements.
Well, while we have you, just going to circle around the wagon a little bit on a few of these things. We have, and Chad McCord likes it when I mention his missions mobilization stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So Germany is in view for Mississippi Baptist this year. At least it's in somewhere on the calendar down the road for a trip. But before you plan on the vision trip to Germany, you've got to, it's good for you to attend one of these Germany Connection meetings, February 11th, 12th, and 13th. That'll be spread across the state, Gulf Coast, in Pearl and Pontotoc. So hopefully that week of February 11th, you can find one of those connection meetings. And then February 27th, at the end of the month, the Worship Media Conference will be at First Baptist Brookhaven for all those worship media creative folks. It'll be a good one-day conference concluded by the Crescent City worship team. More events at mbcb.org/events.
Good deal.
Thank you, Jon.
Yep. All right, let's talk 242. Jon Allen, what is the 242 Network?
So the 242 Network is a primarily Mississippi Baptist-funded network that exists for the church to help come alongside of the church when they have a church planter to assess, to train, to support, and to coach that planter through the process from pre-assessment work all the way through the assessment process in hopes that we have a self-sustaining, gospel-centered, life-giving church in a community.
So 242 Network, just history, can you give us that a little bit? So you started out as different networks, and ultimately those networks came together as one.
Yes. So we started off, the Go Network was in the central part of the state and the south part of the state. Mm-hmm. And then the north part of the state had the 1-8 Network, which was George Ross, Wade Humphreys, and a collection of those guys in the north. And that's the network I was super familiar with because when I planted Eastpoint, the 1-8 Network had just begun. In fact, I was one of the first plants through the 1-8 Network. And then once George left and moved to New Orleans and started working for the North American Mission Board, the state looked at it and said, we don't need two networks. Yeah. We can do one network in the state, and we can look at the state in regards to hubs. And so 242 was birthed out of those two networks, merging together with, I believe Eric Smith was the first guy who was the director of it, and then Paul Bernard took over shortly after that. And Paul led it for the better part of the last 10 years. Paul led it for 6 or 7 of those years.
Yeah.
Go ahead. How unique is this? Is this set up for other states? Are you familiar with how other states are doing this?
So
it's pretty unique, right?
It's pretty unique because a lot of states will just become sin states, and it's not that that's a bad thing, But if we truly believe that church planting could be better done by guys in the state who grew up in the state, who have lived in the state, then who better to assess your planters, train your planters, coach your planters than Mississippi Baptist guys. And so we are unique to most states because most states do not have a church planting network within their state.
That's good.
Yeah, and I would say, too, this is, encouragement to the 242 Network. The success rate of a assessed, coached, encouraged, funded church through the 242 Network is pretty high.
Yes, it's well over 90%.
Yeah.
And at one time, before the network existed, we were batting about 450 to 500, somewhere in there, which means that missions dollars were going to planters that ultimately failed. And what we want to see are healthy church planters.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why assessment is so key, because we look into their marriage with a biblical counselor. We look into their emotional and spiritual health with a biblical counselor. We have a wives assessor to assess their wife. And then we look at their preaching, we look at their leadership history, and then we look at their missional engagement. The reality is, if a man wants to plant a church, but he's not actively sharing the gospel in his day-to-day life, if he has no history of disciple making, he's probably not going to plant a disciple making church.
Yeah.
And so, we assess guys in those 6 areas. And then once they get through that assessment, at this point, every candidate, and we call them candidates because they're not a planter until they plant, but every candidate gets a growth plan from us. That growth plan, I think, is incredibly beneficial because it gives them 6 perspectives into their life to encourage them to grow in their own personal development and ultimately their spiritual development, and helping them to conform more into the image of Jesus and to be a better tool ready to be used in a healthy church.
Yeah.
Search teams need this, man.
They really could benefit from it greatly, but it is a very time-consuming process. The pre-assessment work going into assessment is time-consuming, and then the assessment itself is very time-consuming.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. I've been around your table today. A couple of guys have come up and said, "Hey, you want to be a church planter?" That sort of thing. Yeah. So they have these conversations. If there are people out there that say, what, the Lord may be leading me this way. If you look around and you say, well, what is this 242 thing? How is it connected to Mississippi Baptist? So what do you do with a guy that just shows up and says, I think the Lord might be calling me to church planting?
Yeah. So the first thing I would do, and I've done this today at the table. I've asked guys about, as they come up and talk to me, I said, well, do you know where you want to go? Like where has God given you a burden? Who are the people God is calling you to reach? I think that is a huge question. And then the other question is, would you have a church, a sending church that would come alongside of you who would send you out? Because the 242 network is not, we do not plant churches.
Right.
Churches plant churches. I would argue conventions do not plant churches. That's seminaries do not plant churches. Right. The method to reach the world with the gospel is through the church.
Yeah.
And so we then, if they say, well, my church is First Baptist Jackson, let's just, the state Jackson, for example. So First Baptist Jackson, we would say, well, let's set up a meeting with one of your staff members, your pastor, associate pastor, your missions pastor, and you, and let's talk through what it would look like to plant a church and to go through 242 assessment training. Let's sit down and have a conversation of what that would look like, because the ultimate goal would be to come alongside of First Baptist Jackson, not just the planter, but First Baptist Jackson and the church itself, to help be the one that vets. And because here's the deal, you may have a young guy at your church who wants to plant a church, and you know nothing about his marriage, you know nothing about his finances, you know nothing about his personal life outside of what you see on Sundays and Wednesdays.
Yeah.
What we're able to do with the pre-assessment process and the assessment process is take a deep, deep dive into their life to make sure that before they go out and plant, that their marriage is healthy, that their finances are healthy, and that they're in a place emotionally and spiritually to go plant a church.
Yeah. So you have this introduction conversation, they do the pre-assessment, they go through assessment. I know at that point, just because you go through the assessment doesn't mean the next day you're going to be planting a church.
That's right? Yeah, so, it is a process. And honestly, we only have as much influence as a church or a planter will let us have. And so what I mean by that is, if a guy goes through the process, what we are asking God to do during that time is to add greater clarification to what he's already doing in their life. And so if a guy goes through assessment and he does have a glaring weakness in the area of personal evangelism, or he does have a glaring weakness within his marriage, we will give a growth plan that sometimes it is a 6-month window. Yeah. Sometimes it's an 18-month window in order to see that guy work through that process before he goes out and plants a church. Because again, we want a healthy church plant to be birthed, not necessarily just quick church plants. Yeah. And so being able to go in, give a growth plan, and walk with a guy through that growth plan before he enters into training is incredibly beneficial. And so the candidate has to be on board with that, as well as the sending church, because the sending church could say, we're going to send them anyway. Now, we would wave, an orange flag pleading with them not to do that.
Yeah.
Because one thing that our guys, our network employees, we're not the most gifted guys in the world. I don't think. Well, we do have one guy that's a doctorate degree on our team. Shout out Will Wall.
Yeah.
But we're not the smartest guys in the world. But we know church planting.
Yeah.
And so what we're able to do is give insight that a pastor may not have in regards to church planting. And so we want to help that church and help that planter plant a church for the long run that's going to reach self-sustainability and that's going to be healthy. And so, very seldomly do we have somebody go through just completely ignore what we advise. Most of the time, they're on board with it. And even if they don't see exactly why we recommended what we recommend, they go with it. And in the end, I think it works out for the planter, the sending church, and for the Mississippi Baptist Convention.
And I know this is a big part of your extended giving through the state offering of Margaret Lackey helps 242, and that's a big component of the ministry. But you kind of alluded to this just a second ago, but I know you have sermon to preach on Sunday. You have a lot of things on your plate. You are a full-time pastor as well as other people on your team. But can you? And I was going into that because I was thinking the structure and the strategy, the intentionality that is already in place for you guys is incredible. But talk about that team. Like, what's the structure of your team? I know you now are in a different role than you have been because of some changes.
Because Brian Tillman quit. He's a quitter.
Brian Tillman.
That's what I'm setting up.
So there are several things. The first thing I would say is when I went to my leadership team at Eastpoint with the possibility of changing roles within the network, my lead team has recognized that the last 8 years of working for 242 has not only benefited me personally, it's benefited our church.
Yeah.
So as Eastpoint gets more and more into the, hey, we're an established church, the tendency for churches as they get older is to start looking inwardly at themselves. And what being around church planters keeps me keenly aware of is the lostness around us. And so I think personally that being a part of 242 directly benefits the church that I pastor.
Yeah.
And so when this opportunity came up to change roles within the network, my leadership team, there was no pushback. It was whatever you need to do. This is kingdom work, and we benefit from it. We benefit from it. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is all of our guys within the state and ladies in the state that work for 242, they're all largely part-time. I mean, we're trying to get as much as we can out of them without infringing upon their family and without infringing upon their church. And so I think we've got the best team in the world.
Yeah.
If you want to know about multi-ethnic ministry, then you need to look no further than Brian Crawford and Matthew Morgan down in the Delta. Those guys are doing it, and they're doing a phenomenal work at it. If you want to know about being creative, then go look at what Bryant May is doing at the Exchange. If you want to know about healthy church polity and ecclesiology, Ben Williams at Redeemer Baptist in Olive Branch, our North Hub leader, is I call Ben all the time, and I'm working through things structure-wise within our church and bouncing things off of him. Will Wall over in the East Hub now has kind of replaced Andy as Andy's role has changed, and Will Wall has got a vast wide range of ministry experience. And then Brian CeeLo down on the coast is the smartest guy in the world. I say that. I mean, every time I'm around Brian CeeLo, I don't think he knows how smart he is. And so I think we collectively that we have, when it comes to missiologists within the state, thinking through how to reach the state from a missionary perspective. And one thing that I think it was John Calvin used to talk at length about was the missionary pastor. We have got to be missionary pastors who are engaging a lost world with the gospel through a church context. And so these guys know how to reach the state, and they know how to reach communities and how to train guys and how to do that. And so it is a challenge because they do have full-time jobs, and they are super talented, and their time is demanding of them. But one of the things that Andy and I, as we've kind of moved into new roles, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but one of the things that we've talked at length about is better communication. And look, the network doesn't need major changes with Brian Tillman leaving. Paul Bernard and Brian Tillman did a great job
absolutely
leading this network. But one of the things that Andy and I have talked about just to be able to maximize our efforts is to have better communication with our guys, and then clearer roles for the guys within the network so that we know who's doing what and what they're doing and how they're doing it. So when you're looking at from pre-assessment all the way to post-assessment funding, there are different links in the chain along the way, and we want every network employee to be a part and take ownership of a different link in the chain so that it goes from one man to the next man to the next man to the next man all along the process. So we've got a clear process. And so Brian Tillman has been our director. And so when I met with the board, with Brian Tillman leaving, we talked at length about what it looked like to have a couple of guys in that role. And so I think the technical term that we have is executive director and coordinating director. And so I'm operating as the executive director, handling church relations, vision, anything big picture, mission, and leading the team. And then Andy, who is a godsend, because he's very thorough, he's more type A, and as far as the day-to-day things, following up with the team, I could ask the team to do something, and if Andy's not the one following up and checking in, then what I'm asking is not going to happen. And so having Andy come in that role is going to be key, and very excited to work with Andy and to see what God does.
Yeah, that's cool, and I'm so grateful for you and Andy being willing to step up and be in that role. I worshiped with Andy yesterday, by the way. I don't know if we talked about this, but what a cool experience that was. And so, just so people understand, so 242 Network is an entity of itself.
Yes,
as you said, mostly funded by Margaret Lackey funds, and then also as a result of having finished pre-assessment, finished assessment, given the thumbs up, green light, go ahead, move forward with planting your church, have a sending church. There's some other chains in there that have to be checked off. But then at that point, once you finish that process, right, there's funding available for your church plant. And can you talk a little bit about that funding mechanism, how that comes about and all that?
Yeah, so Jon Maxey, who has been in his role now for what, 9 months? A year?
Probably.
Yeah,
we
just over a year and a month. Yep.
So Jon Maxey replaced a longtime vet that we worked with when I planted, Johnny Irvin, and so Johnny Irvin was part time within the state convention, and so when Johnny officially retired and for the second time and went into retirement, Jon Maxey came into his role, and so we have a very good relationship with the state. And so when a guy is finishing up his training, we get to the last several sessions, there's a process that takes place in order for that guy to get funding. And so that process is getting with Jon Maxey, walking through whatever other necessary steps are necessary there to make sure that there's no hiccup from the time that training is over and funding starts. Because most of the time, by the time a guy gets through the last training session, he has planted.
Yeah.
Like he is planted or he is planting in the next few months kind of thing. Very seldomly does a guy get through training and he's like, I'm going to plant in a year and a half.
Yeah.
And so a guy's going to go jump into planting immediately. And so working with Jon, and actually, I think Jon has actually raised them out. We're given to church plants now, which is incredible encouragement to me.
Yeah.
And so a plant's going to get that funding for a 3 to 4 year window, depending on their context.
Yeah.
And so, take for example, if you're going to be planting a church, like Marquise Gooden, who's a great brother, planting in Holly Springs area. I think Marquise is still in funding. He may be rolling off. But when Marquise was like, do I do the 2 year thing or do I do the 4 year thing? I'm like, brother, you're in a very difficult area.
Yeah.
Your ministry and who you're trying to reach, it's going to take a long time to get to self-sustainability. I said, so you need to do a 4 year funding window to get to that. And so that's the route he went. And so Mississippi Baptist comes alongside in a big way after we assess, train, and coach a guy, and they come alongside and fund him in a big way to help him get going.
Yeah, it's obviously a great benefit to Mississippi Baptist because you guys are equipped to do the assessment and training, and I think those two things connected together, 242 and Mississippi Baptist, makes the success, if you want to use that word, it makes it happen because they have a little a little startup cash, endurance cash, and then the training that they need to make it work. And so grateful for 242 Network.
I want to conclude on just settling back in on the mission going forward and what's happening in Mississippi. Just to remind people, and I know some people are probably thinking, okay, church planting in Mississippi, like what's the deal? Like why Mississippi as opposed to other areas of the country? Here we are in the Bible Belt. So I want to speak to the lostness in our state and why we need to keep planting. I'm talking so you can think about your answer here, but it's so important, right? It's so important, these different areas of our state. We have DeSoto County, the hustle and bustle of the Memphis suburb area, all the way down to the coast, all the way to the Delta and East Meridian where Will Wall is. And so why is church planting in Mississippi important? Because that's what we're talking about today with 242. And why are we pressing on and full speed ahead, right? New leadership, and we're moving forward.
Y'all would have the numbers better than I do as far as across
Just
the state.
ballpark.
But Mississippi is largely unchurched. 73 to 6%, depending on what numbers you're looking at, unchurched. And so we have a much larger unchurched population than we've ever had within the state. And so the need to plant churches is always there. And if you couple the need to plant churches with the lostness that's there, along with churches that are closing their doors, and I don't have those numbers in front of me.
I hear it's 3 to 1. 3 closed to every one that's planted.
Yes. And so people may think, do we need, and I had a guy out there earlier ask me, do we need more church plants? And I said, brother, if we don't plant more churches, there won't be any churches left in Mississippi. If we don't plant churches, we're gonna die as a convention. And so what's going to happen is these communities that have always had a gospel light, it may not be any bigger than 30 to 40 people over in this little small country church, but man, the gospel's preached. People are gathering. People are praying. People are sharing the gospel with neighbors. To say that their lifespan is over and those doors are closed and we don't need another church to be planted within that community is a disservice to that community. And so, the most effective evangelistic methodology for reaching the world with the gospel is to plant more churches. And so that's I believe that, and I think the need to plant churches is greater today than it was 10, 11 years ago when the network started. And if we don't see major change, it's going to be greater tomorrow than it is today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I understand some guys, hey, it may be cooler to go plant in Las Vegas instead of Como, Mississippi, right?
Correct. And so it is,
But the gospel's needed there.
And we talk at length about how the entire state is moving to bivocational kind of ministry. And I think we're seeing that within the church planting world as well.
Yeah.
There is a new work going on in Como, Mississippi.
There
at
is.
the old Como Baptist Church.
Yeah.
There are 2 small groups. There's some guys from Longview Point who are going in there and investing their life right now in that church. And it's going to look different than what I've planted in Lewisburg.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think understanding context, and I think understanding that every church isn't going to be a mega church. We're planting Dollar Generals here. Anywhere you see a Dollar General pop up, you can see is, hey, there needs to be a new church plant there because they know there are people there.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so we've got to get away from this idea that church is 500-600 people and get into, hey, a church is the gathering of the saints, 25, 50 people. We can plant a gospel life-giving church in a community. That pastor may not be full-time. But he can plant a church there. He can work a job, and he can he can shepherd his people well and mobilize them to live on mission.
As Steve Gaines said, there are no big churches and little churches. They're just churches.
That's right.
So, they're just churches.
So what I heard you say is that you go to Dollar General, get your milk and bread, and then you get your Jesus next door, right?
That's exactly right.
I never thought of that. All right, John Allen, appreciate your time. Glad to catch you here in Brandon Evangelism Conference. Appreciate you, brother.
Mississippi Baptist, thank you for listening to today's episode. My name is Ashley Herring, and I serve as the Director of Financial Services. Financial Services assist churches and church staff with understanding the Guidestone Church Retirement Plan and insurance, and helps with their enrollment. We also help teach churches about ministerial taxes, pay structure, housing allowance, mission dignity, and other related business needs. If you have any questions for our department, please email me at aherring@nbcb.org.